I'm really excited about this session. I do want to say that I heard Jim Kowalski speak about this program and what he's doing in Florida, and I immediately reached out to him to say we need to talk with housing counselors about this. Um, so we have Jim Kowalski, the president and CEO of Jacksonville Area Legal Aid in Florida. Jim was one of the first consumer lawyers in the nation to uncover the mortgage banking practice of robo-signing. The Wall Street Journal blamed him for causing the housing crisis. And in December 2010, he testified before the United States House of Representatives Committee on the Judiciary on the topic of foreclosed justice causes and effects of the foreclosure crisis. And Stacy Tutt is the Homeowner Assistance Fund Coordinator and Senior Staff Attorney at National Housing Law Project. She's been on a couple of times, so she may be familiar to some of you. Her work focuses on the national implementation of the Homeowners Assistance Fund, predatory lending, mortgage servicing, and energy efficiency housing finance. And prior to joining NHLP, Stacy designed and directed the Consumer Law Clinic at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Stacy to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Ellie. And I'm really excited to be here with all of you. I'm going to go ahead now and just start sharing my screen. Jim and I did put together a few slides for us today to help us just in covering all these important issues that we see going on in and around registry and really funding, right? What we just heard, sadly, listening to your agenda, we're all struggling right now with the new administration on ensuring that there is sufficient funding for the very essential services housing counselors provide, as well as legal service providers provide. But in addition to that, there's a real struggle in and around helping our borrowers stay in their homes and prevent foreclosure. One thing I had the privilege to work on over the last few years was the implementation of the Homeowners Assistance Fund program. And I bring that up because that funding was so essential and really stopping another housing crisis, or I should say foreclosure crisis, because we are in a housing crisis. Let's not ignore that fact. But to really stop another foreclosure crisis following COVID, the Homeowners Assistance Fund was just so valuable, not only in providing direct relief to our homeowners in the form of those grants in most states and kind of that direct assistance that was provided by the program, but also a number of states used their half dollars to also fund housing counseling and legal services for these borrowers. Regrettably, though, what we're at this point in time is that the states have exhausted those funds. And so we no longer have that federal funding that is available for our homeowners assistance or for our homeowners and to provide that assistance. The other concern that we have as well is without funding for legal service providers and housing counselors, we're going to lose some of this amazing expertise that we have gained over the last few years because we had that funding in order to be able to provide those services. So what we are here to talk to you about today is the next phase. What comes next and how can we ensure that there is more consistent funding for these very valuable resources? I myself and at the National Housing Law Project, I should mention, we do provide technical assistance and are a support center for housing counseling agencies across the country, as well as for legal service providers. But we've been doing a lot of advocacy in California. And one thing that we've been focused on in California right now is, again, funding for our legal service providers and housing counseling programs. We are very excited that we've been able to secure about 4 more years of funding. We're just waiting to hear back on those grant applications. But again, we have seen this happen time and time again, where we get funding for 2 to 3 years or 3 to 4 years. But then that funding goes away. There's a reduction in staff that we have, a loss of expertise, and then we have to rebuild it all over again. So we want to try to stop that. And we want to try to come up with a more consistent funding source for all of us. And that includes our homeowners, our attorneys and legal service providers, and our housing counselors that work within all of these programs. And so What we want to go through with you today is actually raise up an amazing, I call it a case study, but just an amazing example of collaboration and hard work to protect homeowners in Jacksonville, Florida. So I will promise turn this microphone over to Jim here soon to discuss that program and the success that they've been having within it by their collaboration in Jacksonville. Then we're going to dive into that model a little bit more and discuss some of the aspects of it and how those could be replicated in the states or municipalities that you work in. And we really want to break it down to think about how this could work and how we can use this system to align our work with each other and obtain the necessary resources for direct benefits to homeowners and housing counseling and legal service programs. And we're going to go a little more bit in depth too about how to work with legal service providers on fee generating foreclosure claims that can also be an excellent resource. We then have gotten a lot of resources together for you that we've put together to use as examples or advocacy tools in this. And we'll also be talking about a new working group that we are going to be forming. So hopefully I have you all very excited about what we're going to be talking about today. But first, as we start, as many of you know, there's nothing more telling than hearing the stories of our homeowners who directly experience these programs and benefit from them. So we're going to start out here today hearing from a homeowner in Jacksonville and the services she was able to obtain thanks to registry fees. So here we go.
My husband and I were married 60 years, and we never left each other's side. We've always been together. My husband passed away in 2017, May of that year. And after that, things got rough for me because I didn't have his income anymore.
She was delinquent on her mortgage and in foreclosure, and she had tried to do a modification on her own, and it was denied. So due to her loss of income from losing her husband, she got in trouble.
The man delivered the foreclosure paper, and I had to sign for it. And it was so humiliating besides the fact that I was going to lose my home.
Jacksonville Area Legal Aid's job is to stop the foreclosure and defend the foreclosure in court and hold that track, while the partnership's job is to save the home with the loan modification. Those two work together, we both work together, and in this case to save Miss Hewell's home.
What you're looking at here is Tommy's file. I brought it to show the amount of work it takes to succeed. When it was all said and done, she was given a loan modification. Her loan was underwritten again, and she was allowed to keep her home with an affordable payment.
Because of the lack of affordable housing, we know how important it is that we have a solution to keep homeowners in their home. And many of our homeowners, including Ms. Tommy, could possibly face homelessness if we're not successful.
Without St. John's Housing Partnership and Mr. Kowalski's group, I would not have made it. The house was already in foreclosure. So it's a blessing to me. They were angels God sent. I fully believe that.
Florida is one of only 3 states that does not provide any state funding for civil legal aid. So we use a combination of different funding. In this case, we receive funding to help elderly people. The St. John's Partnership also struggles with their funding, but this is an absolutely critical part of the economic interests of the region. Allowing folks to age in place in their homes is very cost effective for a county and for a state.
I've seen 7 deer at one time right here in the front yard. I would not be here were it not for y'all.
Well, we're happy to have helped.
Oh, I love my home and thank God for it every day because I almost didn't have it. I've been here since 1985, and this is where I intend to be when God takes me home. This is my property. I love it so very much. I can't thank you enough.
All right, so thanks, Stacy, and good afternoon or good morning to everybody. We wanted to start with this video, and really we're going to start by going backwards, back to the recession, back to the housing crisis, because we really learned so many lessons from that experience that were applied into half and are going to be applied and deployed going forward. By way of background, Stacy and I both come to the position of being very strong advocates for the partnership between civil legal aid and HUD housing counselors. We come at that from two different directions, but we arrive at the same spot. That is a best practices model. And as Stacy said, we're then going to go on to talk a little bit about how to fund that best practices model. By way of background, JALA is a non-LSC. For those of you who know the difference between LSC funded legal aids and non-LSC funded, we're a non-LSC funded civil legal aid, primarily focused on Northeast Florida. We have 3 housing counselors on staff and a little over 40 lawyers. So we are a large non-LLC by Florida standards. We're actually the 3rd largest civil law firm in Northeast Florida. My first experiences with housing counselors, as I mentioned, came about during the housing meltdown, the recession, when I was asked before I came to JALA to start a project in St. Johns County with the housing partnership to focus on the burgeoning problems with foreclosures just in that county. And so we worked with our partners, we worked with the clerk of court, we worked with the judges, we worked with the housing partnership, we worked with civil legal aid, our St. John's office, and with pro bono lawyers to kind of create a funneling effect. And we'll talk throughout this about ways that you create that funneling effect so that homeowners are reaching you and not one of the many, 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 many more now inventive scammers that will come in and try to strip equity and move them into different predatory products. But so what we did, and you have this in your materials, I wrote a letter to HUD explaining what we refer to office-wide as the St. John's model that explains how we created that funneling effect. You'll see a court order that directs a notice be served with the summons in all foreclosures in St. Johns County. And that moves the case to the initial triager, which is the HUD housing counselor. And it's only if the HUD housing counselor confirms there's a match, confirms there's an option here to save the home, that the case then goes over to a legal aid lawyer for that further review. And one of the things we were able to talk to the judges about is the effect of dual tracking, which was rampant then, remains rampant now, and the fact that we needed a mechanism to slow down the foreclosures in a judicial foreclosure state so the housing counselors could do their job. And so what the judges agreed to do is if the housing counselors confirmed there was a possible solution, they'd met with the homeowner, they'd started to do the math not being an issue that lawyers typically get involved in. They'd done the math, they confirmed there was a match. We filed a motion on behalf of that homeowner that told the judge there was a possible match. We called it a Joy motion, named after Joy Bryant, who was one of the housing counselors that we worked with to develop this. And the judges would pause the foreclosure for 120 days because that's how long it took for the housing counselors and the loan servicers, the loss mitigation departments, to make their match. And then we study that. And you'll hear about this throughout our presentation. It's part of the research that Stacy is doing because we're very focused on showing the structural benefit to the housing market as a result of this work. And we were able to show in one year that we measured very closely that 20.65% of all foreclosures filed in St. Johns County, and this is a county with a decent amount of second homes that wouldn't qualify, but 20.65% of all foreclosures resulted in a non-judgment result as a result of this partnership, as a result of this strategy. And there is nothing that gets a state court judge's attention more than explaining that you're going to pull a fifth of their cases off of their docket as a result of a partnership. So in your materials, you've got the HUD letter that explains the teamwork. You've got the order that establishes the notice that goes into the summons that again creates that funneling system. So you'll see in the letter to HUD, again, that we pay very close attention to how the work benefits the basic housing structure. And I'm glad Ellie mentioned messaging at the top of this, because part of the messaging that you can help drive is from your local partners to their federal representatives or their state representatives. Typically, cities, counties are very involved in and pay close attention to the housing structures of their economy, particularly in states like Florida that doesn't have, one of the 7 states that doesn't have a state income tax. So we're very over-reliant to fund our local government with property taxes. And these sorts of partnerships stabilize the housing market, stabilize the economy, and keep those property taxes moving, keep the entire local economy moving. And sometimes your local partners are the ones that you want to reach out to Washington, which typically is not aware of this work unless those representatives have worked locally, or to your state capitals. Again, those folks are less invested in local housing markets unless they come from local politics before they moved on to the state capital. So you want to show your local partners how it impacts them. If your state judges are elected, ours are, they are also invested in how that local economy works, particularly if it's an area of law where large members of the community are intersecting with the judicial system, right? Eviction and foreclosures are 2 situations where large members of the community are impacted potentially negatively by their interaction with the court system. And so the judges can also be your main advocates. The other reason why we wanted to start with this video, in addition to explaining this partnership, is something that's not shown in the video. So this was really one of my first exposures to how housing counselors are so good at bringing in other resources to deploy to solve a loss mitigation problem. And of course, we're going to talk about that later. That's really where HAF comes in. It's where the registry comes in. Miss Hewell couldn't afford the loan mod. After her husband passed, she didn't have sufficient income to make the math work. She needed a little bit of money. And I don't recall, I think Marissa's on this call. I want to say it was less than $200 a month that she needed to close that gap, and she didn't have it. Her daughter did. Her daughter had substantial disposable income, but she was too embarrassed to call her daughter. And I know many of you are very used to this, particularly with seniors, where they will share extensively with you in ways that they won't share with their family. And so the housing counselors called me and we talked this through, and I said, let me call her. And so I called up Miss Hewell and I said, here's the thing. In a couple of days, you're going to call your daughter and you're going to have one of 2 conversations. You're either going to say, I got into trouble. I've got a team helping me. We need a little bit of money to close this gap, and I can live independently in my home, and I need your help. Or you're going to call her and say, me and my little dog are moving in, and I'm spending the rest of my life sleeping on your couch. Which call do you think your daughter will appreciate more? Of course, she called the daughter, was able to open up. We were available to answer any questions that her daughter might have. Her daughter was happy, as you might imagine, to confirm that monthly catch-up amount. And so we really brought all three aspects together, right? We brought the work of housing counselors, we brought civil legal aid, and we brought the housing counselors' ability to deploy other resources to make that loan modification work. And Ms. Hewell's case was a good example of that. So we learned from the housing crisis what works. We learned that this partnership model, civil legal aid, housing counselors, is the gold standard. It is the model. And we learned that we needed some amount of money for catch-up funds to put towards the loan mod for those percentage of cases where the person had dropped below what was sustainable, but they had regained that amount. They could afford the loan going forward, but they needed that amount to catch up and solve this puzzle. And of course, that is what HAF was. Stacy's really the national expert on HAF, and she'll talk a little bit more about that. But HAF is gone, as she mentioned. We still know what works. We still need to pay for it. How do we pay for it? Next slide, please. So again, I'm going to take you still back to the housing crisis and talk about our building our registry program in partnership with the city of Jacksonville. By the way, we also have a statutorily compliant, court-based, county-funded eviction diversion program that we both created before and have learned from and continue to fund post ERAP expiration. So for those out there in Washington or Oregon or Vermont or California, should you be a little embarrassed that somebody from Florida is teaching you how to do this? Maybe, but the good news is we share. I was always taught that if you discover something cool or you create something cool, you've got to share it out, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So when I joined JALA full-time 12 years ago, this last summer, Jacksonville had a registry program. And I think many of you, when you start working with Stacy and Ellie on this project going forward, many of you will find that you might have registry ordinances that are dormant or small. These exploded during the recession. We'll talk about why. And Jacksonville had one. It was small. I want to say it was $100 that the servicing bank had to file when they filed the notice of lis pendens. It was not recurring, so the foreclosure could last as long as the foreclosure was going to last, obviously sometimes years in cases, but the bank only had to make that one deposit. And it was really not sufficient to address the issues that Jacksonville and other communities were seeing as a result of the foreclosure crisis. Rampant foreclosures, a substantial increase in zombie foreclosures. There was a time that we led the state in both foreclosure rate and homicide rate, which I always really thought should be on the sign at the airport, right? Welcome to Jacksonville, proudly leading Florida in foreclosures and homicides. But, and let me talk about zombies for just a second, because it's really representative. We've been talking about how to message, right? How do you convey how your work impacts the structure of the housing market and the structure of the local economy? And zombie foreclosures are really that for registries, right? So for those who don't know, servicing banks sell foreclosed properties as a result of an algorithm and as a result of controls that are usually found in a very long document called a pooling and servicing agreement. And those sales don't have anything to do really with what's best for the local housing market or what's best for the local economy. It has to do what's best for the investors that are backing the pooling and servicing agreement, that have bought these securitized funds as as an investment. And so you see with zombies where the servicing bank may reverse the entire foreclosure process because it's not going to get enough money at the sale even after potentially there's been a sale and it's sold it to itself and now it's trying to market it as an REO property. If it's not going to achieve enough per the algorithm and the pooling and servicing agreement, the servicing bank has no issue with reversing everything all the way back. So setting aside the sale, a motion to set aside a sale, setting aside the foreclosure judgment, a motion to set aside the judgment, dismissing the foreclosure, and holding it in abeyance until something happens where the housing market algorithm works for that home. So what do you have? You have a homeowner, a family, who may have moved out when they first got the summons. They may have moved out when the judgment was entered. They certainly moved out when the house was sold, and now they're back on title. And the code enforcement reports for this now empty house, the grass is growing, worst case scenario, crime moves in. All of that now goes on the back of the municipality. It's not something the state's worried about. It's not something the federal government is worried about. It is something that the city has to deal with. And Jacksonville was dealing with miles of residential blight. We know from some of the studies during this period that a foreclosure causes a statistically significant increase in violent crime. Jacksonville was dealing with all of that, and the registry money wasn't generating enough to help the city pay for the cost of what the servicing bank was imposing on the structure of housing in the city. So I worked with our city council, and they agreed to modify the registry in line with what other registries were doing. California was a leader on this. By the way, I went to college and law school in California, so even though I'm here, I'm going to give a lot of credit back to there. And we modeled this after registries that had changed how they were focusing so that the city could deploy the cure for what the servicing banks were causing. The initial amount was substantially increased. It was made recurring so that every year the foreclosure continued, a new registry amount needed to be deposited. And we added the parameters for spending that you have in your materials. Because a fine or fee has to be spent consistent with that fine or fee, or it is an unlawful taking, you have to be careful about the deployment of the money, as Stacy will talk about later when she expands or when she talks about foreclosure registries or vacant property registries in general. But I've given you in the materials the spending parameters for really what was the second iteration. We're on a third iteration that I'm going to talk about, but it's that second iteration that I want to hold up as a model because it allowed registry dollars to be spent both on housing counselors and on homeowner assistance, up to $12,000 for the homeowners who were assisted. In iteration three, the city began drawing down SHIP funds, which are CDBG dollars that pass to our state housing agency that then can flow to all of the 67 counties to work on or to use for affordable housing. And now the city of Jacksonville uses SHIP dollars for the up to $12,000 in homeowner assistance funding that goes to the bank on behalf of the homeowner. By the way, the homeowner has to bring something to the table as well. You want to make sure that this is a affordable program and that the homeowner can remain in the home as opposed to using either SHIP dollars or registry dollars or city dollars to catch up and then just simply sell the home and flip the home using other resources. We don't really want that. We want them to remain in the home because that's the entire purpose of stabilizing these different structures. So I've given you the prior guidelines. It's on the slide here, how it's deployed between foreclosure prevention, neighborhood development. A significant amount is used under the neighborhood development rubric for code enforcement. And code enforcement has really been a traditional deployment of registry money because that's really what the cities are dealing with as a result of servicing bank behavior, right? These vacant homes, these miles of residential blight. And there's a cost to the city that we saw later in some very large lawsuits. Miami Beach City of Miami Beach sued Bank of America and a bunch of other servicing banks in a case that went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court because the City of Miami Beach was able to show this is what we're paying. This is what we're having to spend on police, on code enforcement, on fire, on resources for homelessness, right? It's far cheaper to keep somebody housed than it is to try to rehouse somebody who is homeless. And so the city of Miami Beach added that all up. It was a huge amount of money for not that big of a city. And so they sued the servicing banks themselves. But it's really the purpose of why these registries, and again, zombie foreclosures is really a good example to use when you're talking to your locality. I also want to call out, in addition to Duval County, Jacksonville. It's a consolidated county, so it's one and the same. I also want to call out one of our partners in one of our neighboring counties, Clay County, which is a smaller county to our west. They use SHIP dollars, again, because they can be used for affordable housing, CDBG dollars. They use SHIP dollars for housing counselors as well, in addition to funding our Clay County office. The third branch, by the way, for the city, just so I close that loop, you've got SHIP dollars for homeowners assistance, also previously permissible use of registry dollars in Jacksonville. You've got registry dollars to pay for the housing counselors, and then we apply for a grant with the city of Jacksonville that funds the lawyers, right? Because Florida is a judicial foreclosure state. Somebody's got to go to court because dual tracking has never been prevented by the federal government. Somebody's got to go to court to stop the foreclosure or to assert that loss mitigation affirmative defense while the housing counselor is working on loss mitigation. So our program, registry, SHIP, county dollars, is really those three legs of that model that we want to get to. Next slide, please. So here's the result of the program. Provides up to, as I said, up to $12,000 in assistance with mortgages, HOAs, COAs as well. And in 3 years of this current structure, even though our model goes back more than 10 years since we began deploying registries for these purposes, we've assisted 345 clients just in the last 3 years with $2.85 million in direct financial assistance. Now, when a case is closed, and Ellie led with messaging, I talked about messaging, I'm going to close with messaging. When a case is closed, our housing counselors really focus on having the client tell the story, right? Learning how to tell these stories and learning how the story interacts with the structure of your economy is the message you're trying to drive, particularly for elected officials. And videos like the one we showed at the beginning are not expensive. These are not hard to do. It's just a message you have to hone so that your staff and you know how to drive a consistent message as you're moving forward. So when one of the Jacksonville cases is closed, our housing counselors ask the homeowner to tell the story. Just write a note. What did this mean to you? How did this affect your life? And then we package that up and I send a letter to their city council person using their words and explaining that the city and JALA have worked together to benefit one of their constituents. And we included an example of those letters in your materials. So I'm going to return this back over to Stacy to give you an expanded view of how these registry structures work. And then a little later on, we'll turn to attorney's fees and another way to fund one of your partners. Thanks, Stacy.
Thanks, Jim. So many of you may already know and know some of this history or lived some of this history with the foreclosures and what we saw. But as you can see on the slide, back in 2008, we had that huge, that was when the housing bubble burst and the foreclosure crisis happened. And what ended up happening is during that global financial crisis between September of 2008 and the end of 2012, there were more than 4 million residential property foreclosures that were completed. What also happened during this time, and actually before I go into that, just real quick, we can see since that time, there's been a steady decline in foreclosures and improvements that were made. What you can see right here in 2020 was the steps that were taken under the CARES Act and with HAF in order to prevent foreclosures through the foreclosure moratoriums that took place, but then were followed by direct financial relief to our homeowners to help them get on track. What concerns me, though, as may concern many of you and those of us who are working in this, is we can see right here in 2025, the uptick has started yet again. This is because of our rising interest rates that we see, the lack of loan modification options that are available, as well as the loss of our HAF dollars. What was interesting, though, during this time, when we go back to looking at between 2008 and 2012, what we did see here as well in many different areas, as we heard about Jacksonville, Florida, were hit harder than others. But during this time, there was actually a 44% increase in the number of vacant housing units that were out there. So there were over 4.5 million vacant homes. So to address this and what was happening here, we saw a significant increase in what were called vacant property registries. It was an attempt then to address the neighborhood blight, the rising crime rates that were being seen, and in order to track these properties and ensure that they were being maintained and safe while they were unoccupied. And between, let's see, it was just before the foreclosure crisis, there were only 87 vacant property registries that were out there. But then by May of 2012, there were over 550. And as we look at this and we look back on those models and what was done within those programs, what we saw during this time period were three types of registries that were happening. One of the registries that were first introduced and used by properties were vacant or abandoned models. That would require a property to be registered within a certain amount of time in which it became vacant. The servicer would have to indicate then who was responsible for the property and also provide maintenance of that property. As time passed, and it was around 2007, what we saw was this movement towards the foreclosure model. And this was in Chula Vista, California. We saw this where they started registering properties upon the foreclosure, anticipating that they may become vacant and wanting to monitor and know what was happening with them. Now, today, as we sit here, there are a number of models of this. We can see that there's what we call the hybrid model, which includes both vacant properties as well as foreclosure properties. Most of the time, the ordinances will require that maintenance of it and secure that property to address the blight that we see. There's usually a periodic registration fee. Oftentimes that fee increases the longer the property remains vacant, and that's to incentivize it coming back to being more affordable housing and help address our housing crisis that we're also currently in and address some of that gamesmanship that Jim talked about of getting the properties back on the market. In addition to that, requiring a certain amount of insurance or a bond for that property, also allowing for inspections of the properties to make sure that they're being maintained. And then if they're not, to then impose a penalty or even potentially criminal penalties for failure to register and maintain those properties. And so what I'm showing here too is on these slides, you can see where some of these ordinances were, the different types and the states in which we could see these registries taking hold. Now, one thing you can do in order to know if you have a property registry is that please know that oftentimes these are based upon a local ordinance or a city ordinance, more of a local municipality may be monitoring that program. There are some state statutes that are out there, which I'm going to touch on here for you, but otherwise there are resources out there to look and find whether or not the area in which you are serving already has a property registry. Safeguard Properties does do some tracking of this, and so we've included that website. You can also find some of these ordinances on Unicode or eCode 360. But I also offer to you, I do maintain an Excel spreadsheet and database of all the different ordinance programs that are out there. And I'm always more than happy to share my resources with you and let you know what I'm seeing out there as we continue to analyze and evaluate all the different foreclosure registry programs that are out there. What we have found from our research so far is that these funds can be used for a number of different things. And again, the Jacksonville model is a great one to look at of a more holistic approach to addressing the needs of our homeowners with this funding. One thing that can happen is you will expect some of the fees will need to be used to staff and administer these programs. So then that way they are able to monitor and ensure that properties are registering as needed. In addition to that, we heard about the direct cash assistance that Jacksonville provides. The Homeowners Assistance Fund is a great example of why direct assistance is needed. The academic research is showing that it's negative life events that cause foreclosure, and that a temporary infusion of funds may be all that is necessary to get a homeowner back on track. Right now, with the National Housing Law Project, and also with some help and support from all of you out there who've provided data to Ellie, who's also shared it with me, we will also be publishing some white papers to support advocacy in and around providing direct cash assistance to borrowers and a half-like model. And so we'll be able to bring out some of the best practices. I know some results in half were mixed. I'm not going to paint a perfect rosy picture, but our white papers are really to educate and go into what those best practices are and the value that it offers to our homeowners to have that type of direct assistance. The funding can also be used for community outreach and education. Of course, your all-important credit counseling and HUD certified counseling services. It can also help with mediation services. And I have to just pause here really quick and give a shout out to one of my former partners, Kathy Schubert, who's a housing counselor who worked with me back in Illinois when we set up a mediation program during our foreclosure crisis. And I worked to provide the legal services while her organization was doing the housing counseling. And we really did that collaborative model in trying to help homeowners during that crisis. And so we want to take those lessons again and use that in our advocacy now to get a more consistent funding stream for such things as mediation services, credit counseling, HUD counseling, and legal service providers. Thank you, Kathy. And so but this is not going to be easy. We are saying that this is, we think, a great avenue for advocacy, a great source of funding for the future, but there will be issues to navigate. There are opportunities to advocate for these programs on a state level. So for our larger programs that are out there covering an entire state, there can be some value to advocating for it at the state level. There is, though, oftentimes more movement on the local level, and that's primarily where we've seen this happen in this area. However, we do have state statutes that are out there. And so it is important to be aware that there are some state statutes and how those may influence your advocacy opportunities. So for example, Georgia is an example of a state statute that's going to make it more challenging to do the work in Georgia. And that's only because the Georgia state statute says that you can only require registration after 90 days of vacancy and for a fee of no more than $100. So that's going to be a limitation in those programs unless there's state advocacy to change the state statute and allow for more ability to do that. So there is also in New York, there is a statewide registry. Now, the New York program does place some limitations on the registry, and primarily in not allowing it on state chartered credit unions. And so there are some limitations on the New York statute that's there. But New York also has the benefit of their amazing HOPE network, where they've already really built the infrastructure for housing counseling and legal services providers to step in and help borrowers. And there is a statewide registry. So that may actually make New York really ripe for doing a larger statewide program and looking at doing this as a funding mechanism, because right now New York has to go and ask for funding each year, and that's very challenging. So having a dedicated fund like SHIP in Florida really may be a great option for keeping that strong network and providers going. Connecticut also has a statewide program, and Maryland does as well. And so, and again, I see then the question about other states and that we are continuing to learn on this. So if you have a question like New Jersey, I'm happy to look that up, let you see what I'm finding and whether or not I think that those are out there and available to you. One other thing that we do have to be concerned about is there have been some legal challenges in and around foreclosure registries. One in particular happened in Chicago when they were requiring FHFA mortgages to pay the fee. And so they did actually continue to have their registry, but with limitations on the fees. Again, there may be ways around this, especially as we look to put fees or this with servicers versus the federally backed mortgages and those investors in that. Other issues to navigate are administration costs. And so, you know, you will want to cover those in your fees. We do see a lot more now of technology being used for these online registries and streamlining of these processes, which can be very valuable, especially even for the servicers, that if we're aligning these registries through technology, it can simplify their compliance with all of the various programs that are out there. And then there is also the concern is there's limitations on the use of funds. I think we heard a little bit about that in Florida of it not being available to use for legal defenses in foreclosure, that funding can't be used for that purpose. So understanding that kind of political aspect of this and that pushback you may get can help you understand what are going to be the viable uses of the funds. Another thing that we do get concerned about in this area and that we want to be mindful of, and this is something we did back in Illinois when we were setting up our foreclosure mediation program, is that we did try to keep the fees minimal just in case and in instances where they were passed along to the homeowners. But in that program, we found by simply having an additional $25 filing fee, we were able to fully fund the program and the resources that were needed. And so given the volume, this could actually be done. And I actually, as a lawyer, like to crunch the numbers. So I'm always happy to work on crunching numbers and thinking about what those fees are. But then I would also mention that in some of these instances, it's really the penalties, the non-compliant or those zombie mortgages that are out there where you can really accumulate more of these fees. And if it's a vacant property, there's no homeowner in which to pass it along to. Another concern that can be out there is if there's a lot of fees on these properties, if it actually is a property that is owned by an individual who maybe has to make repairs on the home and they have limited funds, we don't want to see these fees getting added to theirs where it would only prevent them from making those repairs and getting that home back into a safe condition for them to reside in. And so we have heard from the Chula Vista program that their inspectors were given a great deal of discretion to waive fees and to in order to address those repairs. And then that's also where our wonderful HUD certified counselors can come and help our homeowners in explaining the different home repair programs or financing that may be out there to help them with this. So again, there are issues out there to navigate. I only just kind of scratched the surface of some of the things that we're looking at and thinking about, but these are things that we think are going to be important to look and consider what are those best practices that we can be employing for these programs. And who are we going to be working with? Who can we be doing this with together? Of course, all of our wonderful housing counseling agencies that are out there, legal services providers like Jim's program in Jacksonville, Florida. You'll also find a lot of support from your code enforcement and your municipalities. They can give you some great insight on what their needs are, what they're seeing, and tracking of this and what's happening within the local municipality. And then they can become your advocates, as Jim mentioned. They can be the ones even advocating for that state legislation or support for these efforts and become an advocate and vocal supporter of what you're trying to do. Your state financing agencies can also be a good ally in this, as oftentimes the funding will come through their organizations and can be used both for that direct assistance to borrowers or even in the development of more affordable, safe housing, as we see with the SHIP program. There are title companies also may be advocates in this as to especially standardization of requirements, and loan originators as well could be helpful on this, especially those that are more local credit unions and that are very concerned about neighborhood blight and the harms that foreclosure filings can have. And they do not want those properties to be decayed in such a way that is hurting their property values of those loans that they are originating. And so that's why I focus in particular on loan originators. They make their fees and actually people signing up and getting more mortgages. But to be able to do that, they want to have those property values up in the neighborhoods in which they serve. So these are all ways that you can find these potential allies that are out there. So next up, we are going to just talk briefly about how working with legal service providers can also be a source of funding for you and for these partnerships. So Jem, I'm going to let you take it from here.
So I think as Stacy was walked you through as we started, building these coalitions is really cool work. It's very exciting, especially when you have the resources that are on the screen that are available to help you with this. Before I leave, by the way, the registry, for those who are on the call who are with municipalities or who work closely with municipalities, I forgot to shout out the excellent neighborhoods department at the city of Jacksonville. Robert Owenby and his staff are just a delight to work with. And I know they would be open if you are a municipality or you work closely with a municipality to reach out to Robert and his team, and they'll walk you through how they do this from the city perspective. So let's turn to attorney's fees. Everybody just got quiet. I get that. This is a chilling discussion. I can feel the chill all the way to St. Augustine, Florida. All of the housing counselors are thinking, hey, if I call some lawyer and tell them what I'm seeing Wells Fargo do in my case, Wells Fargo is never going to work with me again. Okay, I've got news for you. We already know Wells Fargo did something wrong in your case, and they have no idea who you are. Let's talk for just a second about how risk is assessed normally in litigation. If you get in a car wreck and it's caused by an Allstate insured driver, Allstate uses an advanced computer system called Colossus, I'm not making that up, to set the reserves for that claim. How much they think within a very small range, how much they think that case, or the computer thinks that case should settle for. Knowing you, knowing the damage to the car, knowing the damage to the other car, knowing your medical bills, knowing your medical history, knowing your future prognosis, knowing your employer, etc. All goes into Colossus, spits out a reserve range. If the case settles in that reserve range, Allstate goes on with its life. There's not a lot of questioning about that. The computer system worked, the algorithm worked, Colossus worked. What an odd thing to say. And everybody moves on. Let's say that your lawyer goes ahead and tries that case, and the jury returns a verdict substantially in excess of what Colossus said. Allstate then goes into review mode. Allstate wants to know what happened in that case because it needs to know whether it set its parameters wrong, whether it instructed Colossus in an incorrect way. And there's a lot of discussion about how that happens, why that happened. Now, we learned during the housing crisis that Wells Fargo has reserves of $1 billion a year for claims. That means unless I get $1 billion verdict against Wells Fargo, or we all get collectively $1 billion in recoveries from Wells Fargo, there's nobody at Wells Fargo that is looking at its loan servicing procedures or how those cases got to legal services or consumer protection lawyers. There's nobody. There's nobody at Wells Fargo that's going to out you as a housing counselor if you issue spot an attorney fee claim and you get it over to your legal services partner or a consumer protection lawyer who potentially is also a legal services lawyer. So no one's going to blackball you. Attorney's fees are okay to talk about. They're one of the coolest things for some of us to talk about. So let's talk about them. All right. So generally, all foreclosures are potentially attorney fee generating cases. The reason for that, number one, is because the notes and mortgage contain a provision that allows for fees to be recovered by the foreclosing servicing bank. And in 7 states, Florida is one of them, so is, by the way, our lovely partners in crime, California, Oregon, and Washington, all have these provisions where a one-way provision for fees in a contract is by state law, operation of state law, a two-way provision. And so if the servicing bank can get fees in California, Oregon, Washington, Florida, 3 others, the homeowner can also get fees. But generally, the issues that the homeowners want to raise also fall under a number of different consumer protection statutes, including federal consumer protection statutes. So, for example, in much of the country, certainly in the South under the 11th Circuit, a servicing bank that is operating as a servicer, not a traditional bank, is potentially liable under the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act for its debt collection practices. We can bring FDCPA claims against servicing banks in the 11th Circuit in the Southeast. There are other statutes, state and federal statutes, that apply to those consumer protection counterclaims. So just know that generally foreclosures are an area where legal services, particularly legal services consumer protection lawyers and private consumer protection lawyers, can recover attorney's fees. And I've given you in your materials kind of 2 super common examples, one very common and then one that's more fact specific. And the first one is something you see constantly. It's based on dual tracking, the fact that the servicing banks still push their foreclosures even while their loss mitigation departments are working the loan mods. And those are situations where you've inked the loan mod. You've finished your work. You've done your level 1 and level 2 counseling, but the servicing bank is continuing to press the foreclosure in court. Your homeowner's long since made their trial plan payments. They may be making their uh, loan modification payments for a year, and the foreclosure is continuing. What we do, and you have this in your materials, is we then move forward with a motion to enforce the settlement. And these are delightfully wacky circumstances where the bank witness and the bank lawyer are opposing in court what their own loss mitigation department reached as an agreement with the HUD housing counselor and the homeowner. And we've given you an example like that. We used our HUD housing counselors as expert witness. We coach them up, we get them ready to testify. It's something that they really like to do, I think, because it kind of gives them that voice in court. And so I've given you a motion and an order in a case. I've also given you a kind of over the top aggressive letter that I wrote to CFPB, to Treasury, and to HUD on a really bad example of that in Clay County, where the bank lawyer was accusing us of bad faith for moving forward to enforce a loan modification that the bank itself had reached with a HUD housing counselor. So we ended up still prevailing on that case, but that's kind of the worst case, dual tracking, where they just simply don't listen to their own loss mitigation department. It's not something our federal government has really ever touched. We have told them over and over again that dual tracking is continued. It's supposed to be illegal. I think that was in maybe Dodd-Frank, Stacy, but it's never been enforced. It's rampant in loan servicing, where the foreclosure department and the loss mitigation department are working at cross purposes. The second example, and I've given you a couple of examples, including a loss mitigation example in the materials, is where the servicing bank caused or substantially contributed to the foreclosure itself. And one example, one case where I got punitive damages against the bank was a case where the loss mitigation failure, the dual tracking failure, occurred before the court case was filed, when the homeowner received two letters actually the same day, one from the foreclosure department in Utah and one from the loss mitigation department in Pennsylvania. And the foreclosure department said, "Welcome to foreclosure. You could lose your home." And the loss mitigation department said, "Congratulations on your loan modification." And those two letters were received by the homeowner the very same day. And then, of course, the foreclosure department proceeded to sue her and her mom. So the other example I gave you was really a classic example where during the onboarding process, a servicing transfer, where a lot of these errors can arise, during the onboarding process, the new servicing bank put the home into a flood zone where it wasn't in a flood zone. And the homeowner actually printed out the FEMA flood map and mailed it to the servicer and said, "Here's where I live. Here's where the flood zone ends. We don't have flood insurance, nor do we need to." And the servicing bank forced placed flood insurance and then put them into foreclosure when they didn't pay their increased mortgage payment because the flood insurance got loaded up into the foreclosure, into the mortgage payment. That was particularly harmful for that homeowner because A, the person who got the credit hit was the son who had been paying his dad's loan. He wasn't on the loan. It shouldn't have been his credit hit because he wasn't on the note. Even worse than that, he was a federal contractor. And once the Liz Pendens hit his bonding company, his bonding was pulled and he no longer could bid for federal contracts. So it was kind of a triple whammy following that initial mistake. But a HUD housing counselor will see that first at the very beginning of the case when you're sitting there talking to the homeowner about why they got into this monetary problem. As Stacy said, we know an enormous amount of this are short-term problems, right? We know that from evictions too. These are glitches that then cause this spiraling effect of the loss of housing. Very true for foreclosures. And you'll hear that on the front line as the housing counselor as you begin to meet with the family. And those are cases that you simply have to surface and send over to your legal aid lawyers or your private practice consumer protection lawyers. For those who are on the call who are lawyers, you have to be, please, members of the National Association of Consumer Advocates, as Stacy and I both are. You've got to regularly attend NCLC conferences where these issues are discussed. Join the listservs where these issues are discussed so that there's just an enormous amount of sharing that goes on nationally. The robo signing case that started a lot of this, the GMAC robo signing case, I did with another fellow NACA member who was in the Northeast. And so I took the first set of depots. We learned what GMAC was doing with robo signing. A lawyer named Tom Cox up in Maine took the second set of depots, and he and I ended up testifying to Congress because it kind of exploded after that. But we wouldn't have connected if it wasn't for this amazing attorney and advocate network of consumer advocates that many legal aid lawyers, many private practice lawyers are members. So if you're a lawyer doing this work or touching this work, really would shout that out. They're the lawyers that can help us review these claims for you. And so now I'll turn it over to Stacy to talk a little bit about what she's seen. These are all judicial foreclosure issues, and I'll turn it over to Stacy to talk about what she's seen in non-judicial foreclosure states.
Hey, just
Great,
real quick, Stacy or Jim, if you want to. So NACA means something different for housing counselors. If you could just kind of
Okay, that's pretty funny
illustrate
because
what NACA is
okay.
in the lawyer's world.
And listen, I know this is being recorded. I'm just going to say it. We refer to that as the bad NACA. So the good NACA is the National Association of Consumer Advocates, which is consumeradvocates.org, which is a membership organization made up of consumer protection attorneys all across the country, many of whom are civil legal aid, many of whom are in private practice. And forget I said anything about the other NACA, because that probably was unfair. I was just trying to make a joke that may or may not have landed with this audience.
All right. So on that note, I would mention that yes, a lot of what Jim raised up as examples of servicing errors and problems, these can be raised whether it's a judicial or non-judicial foreclosure state. I've spent the last few years serving as a consumer claims trustee in a DITEC bankruptcy, which means I've evaluated consumer claims from across the country. And I would say there are a number, and too many causes of action probably to list, that a lawyer can bring not only to prevent the foreclosure, but to result in getting damages or fees for the homeowner, as well as fees for their program. In fact, my program at the University of Illinois, when I was there in Illinois, well, it is in Illinois, but when I was there in Illinois, we actually were able to help fund our legal services simply by all of the fees that we gathered in enforcing mediation and in enforcing the agreements. And so we started out with seed funding, and then we used fees to keep us going and operating to be able to provide those services at no charge with even no income restrictions in that program. And that's how we were able to accomplish that. So attorney's fees can be phenomenally helpful in providing resources to your homeowners. And the more you work together, the more funding that can actually be obtained through the fees. So some common examples in non-judicial foreclosure states can do with breaches of the state foreclosure process. Every state is different in the procedures you have to follow. In California, we have the benefit of the Homeowner Bill of Rights. And so that's one that we often use in our litigation to do that. We also see problems in and around servicers failing to reinstate or properly credit payments, and that's something that can commonly brought up. And in fact, some states do allow, as Jim mentioned, debt collection practices can actually be applied, like in California, to the original lender and the servicer. So we can actually go after them as well for any inappropriate collection activities that they engage in. And so these, again, are just some examples, but what we've done here is that we have gone ahead and given you our contact information within our presentation, so you can feel free to reach out to us to do this. I also know we're getting short on time here, so I would just mention we put together a lot of resources. Jem cited to a number of those within his presentation, and so these are all housed for you on a Google Drive, which has been shared with all of you as well, so then you can go in and see these articles and information, as well as look them up if you would like to. And then last but not least is that we are going to be having a property registry working group that's going to be forming, in which we can start working with all of you and your ideas on how we may advance this initiative with local municipalities and advocate for this funding, just share best practices and just really hear from each other about ways that we can advance this. We did this a lot during the halftime. For those of you who may remember working with me on that, it's the same idea that we're trying to do here, but really just in supporting you and your advocacy in and around property registry working groups, as well as that way we can connect with legal service providers and those other partners we mentioned. This can be a space for us to start working together and hearing from them and advocating for this. And so with that, I am going to stop here. As you can tell, Jim and I could probably talk about this all day long, but we do want to make sure that we're getting to your questions if you have any of those. And then, like I said, you can also join our working group on November 4th. If you want to be part of that, just email Ellie or I about that. Really, I'm the one who's going to be tracking that. So feel free to email me and say you want to be part of that, and we'll make sure that you get the invite to the working group meeting. So with that, I think we'll open it up to any questions that we have from the audience.
Great. Well, I'm can't believe it. There's only one question right now. What is the average fee that you can expect for hiring a consumer protection attorney to file a lawsuit, and how much can you recover if you win?
So most of the time, consumer protection lawyers are taking cases on what's called a contingency fee basis. We talked both about the fact that there are fee shifting mechanisms at work here in foreclosures. It's in the note and mortgage, it's in the statutes. So typically, when we're triaging it, certainly civil legal aid doesn't charge at all when we recover fees. They're only from the other side. The total amount you can recover, that's on an individual basis. They can be, if you've got Wells Fargo as a target, they can be quite high recoveries and fund a significant amount of civil legal aid work. But I think it's important, as Stacy mentioned, the three of us, Ellie, Stacy, and I, are certainly able to be your initial triagers, talk you through this. We certainly do realize that asking housing counselors to surface attorney fee issues and immediately refer them over might be a little daunting, and we're happy to help with that and make these connections around the country where they come up. But Stacy, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, I would say absolutely. That's been my experience on the contingency basis. And then, we do have our network of legal service providers. So depending upon their funding sources, they do have certain limitations that they have to abide by. But if they are able to take those cases, those could be your partner and they don't charge any fee at all for the services that they provide. But then often if someone is perhaps over income for their services or doesn't qualify for some other reason, that is where our network of consumer advocates that work on a contingency basis can be really helpful to these homeowners, because we recognize when they're financially struggling, they do not have the resources in which to pay the cost of this litigation upfront.
Right. I will say something that will annoy Stacy because she knows the story, but the example I gave of the forced place flood insurance, this was back in my private practice days before I came to Jala. I went to Germany and picked up a car. So off of that, off of part of the fee of that one case. These are great cases. And the banks, Wells Fargo and some of our national banks, really need a stern talking to. And attorney's fees is what we call a stern talking to.
And I would say for the homeowners, these can be great. I was able to, a few different times on a motion to enforce mediation, get somebody where their whole foreclosure case was dismissed with prejudice, which meant they couldn't bring back the case to foreclose. On a credit reporting case, we actually helped somebody obtain a free house. Their whole debt was forgiven over false credit reporting. So these can be very significant and really can be a mechanism for helping homeowners stay in their homes when it otherwise wouldn't be affordable for them.
Right. And so what we do, by the way, for most of these, just so the housing counselors know how this works, for most of these, the settlement is funneling into the loan mod, right? For the vast majority of these cases where the fees aren't going to defeat the entire loan, the cases where the homeowner gets a house, a clear house, clear title, most of them, you're simply loading it into the math that the housing counselor is using, right? The servicing bank will agree to lop off all of the interest. The servicing bank will agree to lop off a significant percentage of the arrearage. The servicing bank will agree to really extremely productive loan mod terms, extremely low interest rates, because once they know they're caught and you've kind of tagged them, you've grabbed them, they're trying to get out from under that trap. And a lot of that then funnels back to the work that the housing counselor does in solving the loss mitigation question.
And then I did see, Ellie, I hope I'm not jumping ahead here.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Looking for consumer protection attorneys in this area. And I do just want to say, and it doesn't look like I can share here, but I can put that answer into the chat, is that the National Association of Consumer Advocates, NACA, does have an attorney directory that is available and searchable by the public. And that includes, you can search by location and you can also search by areas of practice. And so if you just do, and now again, we got to watch the NACA thing, but if you type in, and I usually do, National Association of Consumer Advocates Attorney Directory, you will get to that website and be be able to find that listing and of attorneys that are available. And then, like Jim and I said, it depends on the attorneys, but the vast majority of them do handle these cases on a contingency basis, which means they get paid only if they're able to win or settle your case.
That looks like all of the questions. I do want to say, so somebody asked in the chat, can you send the invite to everybody who participated? And with clarification, it seems the invite that was being asked for is around the working group for how to figure out whether this is something that your organization in your area can do, and to continue kind of working on that and advocating for it. What we're trying to do is create a working group similar to the Homeowner Assistance Fund working group. So it would be a listserv where you would get the information about upcoming meetings. We have set a cadence for the meeting that begins on November 4th. It'll be the first week of every month. And I think if I remember correctly, it's a Tuesday, first Tuesday of every month. Stacy's shaking her head yes. And that may change depending on who comes in and what time works for people. So we aren't really sending out an invite. We're asking you to let us know that you want to be part of the working group, and then we'll kind of take it from there. Go ahead,
And Ellie,
Stacy.
I did add in my email address, so it's on all the PowerPoints and PDFs everybody have seen, but my email address is in there. Simply just shoot me an email, say join working group. I've already got a few of you, so I'm so excited to see that I've already gotten some emails coming in, but that's all it takes. Just put it in the subject line of join working group and email me, and I've got you covered, and I'll get you on our list. And then that way you'll get the first meeting invite. And then we'll be working to continue, as Ellie described, to build out that working group and work together to decide our agendas, next steps, and what we want to be accomplishing.
All right, so this is kind of just a general kind of foreclosure loss mitigation question, but with so many homeowners currently furloughed, what steps can they take now, or what options are available to help them financially? Some homeowners may have been in trouble before the furlough as well.
Yeah, so in those circumstances, especially with that loss of income, there is the opportunity to look at and pursue different loss mitigation options. If it's going to be a temporary furlough, maybe a forbearance will be sufficient. But anytime you're looking at doing a forbearance, you also want to make sure you have a plan for what any of those forbearance payments, how they're going to be addressed at the end of the forbearance period. And so that can be one of the first options to look at. But in a situation like that too, it'll often depend upon what type of mortgage they have, if it's a federally backed mortgage, and also what state they're in case there are such programs like Florida with SHIP or others that may be available to help those individuals when they have a temporary loss of employment.
And unfortunately, this is going to be something that you're going to use when you're talking and building your registry or some other half replacement, right? Our goal here is to give you one option for a half replacement. There are others. This is just simply one model. And for communities with large numbers of federal workers, with communities like Northeast Florida with large numbers of both veterans and active duty service members, these are things that your elected officials need to hear because, again, the impact is to the structural integrity of a local economy through its housing market. And it's going to be felt locally. The pain is going to be local. Part of what we learned from the foreclosure crisis was that our capitals, state capitals, certainly Washington, the capitals themselves are artificial housing markets, right? Washington, D.C. didn't see a foreclosure crisis because Washington, D.C. is an artificial housing market. Tallahassee, Florida saw much less of one because Tallahassee is an artificial housing market, as are many state capitals. And so many state and federal elected officials simply did not understand the effect on the street of their policies at the state or national level. And this is an example of something else we have to share with them.
Great. Well, I don't see any further questions. So thank you both, Stacy and Jim, for all of your time and effort put into putting this webinar together. I just want everybody who's on to know that Stacy and Jim did a lot of research leading up to this, to make sure that you all got the most pertinent and accurate information possible. So thank you both so much for that. And I'm looking forward to our working group and bringing everybody together to talk more about this. And so with that, let's wrap it up. Go ahead.